From proposed TikTok bans to cell phone crackdowns in schools and scandals like Signalgate shaking public trust, it's clear that the United States is facing a media literacy crisis. But here's the bigger question: why didn't the US invest in media literacy education decades ago when it might have made all the difference? To help us unpack that and dig into what media literacy looks like in 2025, I'm joined by longtime advocate and media literacy expert Frank Baker. Frank, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks, Nolan. It's a pleasure to be with you and to speak to you about this subject and others.
Absolutely. Likewise. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the program is especially since this moral panic over fake news and recent events during Trump's second administration. There's been so much talk and concern about lack of media literacy and how we should change schools. And I think a lot of people are just coming to this conversation. But you've been a part and a leader in this conversation for decades. So, for someone who hasn't followed media literacy education in U.S. schools, can you kind of briefly sort of summarize the history of where it's been offered, and more importantly, when and where it's not been offered?
That's a really good question. I think media literacy began to be emphasized when we began to put televisions in the classroom. Uh, a personal story, if you don't mind. I previously worked for the public school system in Orlando, Florida. And among other things, I was the buyer of films and videos for the schools. And I sat in several classrooms watching the teachers misuse these materials. So this was in the late 90s. I was really appalled. I didn't see one teacher engage students in any critical viewing skills. In other words, they didn't prepare the students with any previewing questions. They didn't introduce any of the vocabulary that students might hear in the film or the video. And they didn't ask students any post-viewing questions. And I began to investigate what at the time was called critical viewing skills. And I don't hear that phrase used anywhere anymore. And I learned that critical viewing skills is a part of something larger called media literacy. And for those who don't know what media literacy is, my simple definition is applying critical thinking and critical viewing skills to all media messages. So that's kind of a narrow definition from somebody that's been involved in education for about 30 years. And the question is, how do we change that? How do we get educators, for example, to recognize that our students, for the most part, don't ask questions? And you and I both know critical inquiry is probably the most important element in the world today. Who's telling the stories, who benefits, who's making money from it, and what do they want us to think and vote for, right? And what products do they want us to buy? We've got opportunities to engage students and teachers. Unfortunately, it's just not happening.
Yeah, and talk to me a little bit about why it's not happening, because sort of what I've kind of gleaned from looking at the interviews and past is that there were kind of two factors playing a role here. One was there's kind of this traditionalist view of education. Folks thought that you start bringing films in the classroom, kids aren't going to read the classics like Shakespeare or whatever. So there was resistance on that front. And then also there's this decentralized education system in the U.S. Right? It's we don't have an education czar to wave a wand and put media literacy in schools. So can you kind of talk about some of those maybe structural or cultural resistance to media literacy over the years that you've encountered?
I can talk to a contemporary example. The conservative movement in legislatures today believes that media literacy is teaching kids what to think, not how to think.
Mhm.
And so the whole definition of media literacy has gotten screwed, if you will. The so-called mainstream media has taken the phrase media literacy and co-opted it. Today, media literacy is being used uh, when they really mean news literacy or information literacy. And I've got to give a shout out to the school librarians in the
Mhm.
United States. They are the one person in most schools, if they're qualified, if they've gone through uh, schools of library and information science, they have that degree, and they are starting to address issues like disinformation and fake news. And algorithmic literacy. But those things, Nolan, have not made their way onto the tests. And so we're not testing media literacy. We've not tested it for years, and educators know if it's not tested, it's not taught. And that's really unfortunate. Our colleagues in Canada developed a media literacy textbook years ago. Uh, they were and continue to be leaders in this movement. Do we need a media literacy textbook today when we've got the internet? I believe that we do, but
Mhm.
would it get used widespread? And who would write it? And how would it be tested? Um, I continue to be, really critical. In my own state of South Carolina, I just recently testified in favor of a media literacy bill. The last time it failed, one of the Republicans in the committee stood up and said, "I don't know what media literacy or digital citizenship means." Well, he hadn't read the bill because it was defined clearly in that bill. So we have to deal with some ignorance. We have to deal with the fact that they are not paying attention to facts. They don't care about facts. In fact, years ago, Nolan, I heard a teacher tell me, my kids don't care if it's fake news. And if that's a widespread sentiment, we've got to deal with their apathy.
Absolutely, very very good point on that front. But I'm also glad to hear that it's also lawmakers, not just students who don't read. So that's comforting. Um, you were, as you were talking there, I was thinking about we've talked a lot on this program about so-called artificial intelligence, and people can go back to the archives and listen to a lot of interviews we've had about critiquing it. But it seems to me kind of you were a part and continue to be a part of a very strong voice asking for media literacy in the classroom going back decades, and we've been unable to achieve that successfully, getting robust media literacy education into our schools. But now we have this new challenge, right? AI has created yet another reason I think why media literacy is critically important. Are you seeing any parallels? Because I keep making this reference that I feel like I'm in 1993, where everyone's telling me this is the great new tool. It's going to solve everything. And if you have any critiques or questions, you're just a wet blanket. Do you see any parallels yourself, though, from being a leading part of the movement to get media literacy in schools back then and what we're seeing now?
Absolutely. When I started in public education, the internet was just coming into classrooms. And you might remember, your audience might remember, if it was on television, you trusted it for the most part. And then the internet entered into the classroom. Uh, 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 I'm taken back to a commentary that Alan November wrote in 1998, teaching Zach to think or teaching Zach to read. I think you can find it on the internet. Zach was a student who submitted a paper, uh, the gist of which the Holocaust never happened. And his teacher said, "Zach, what do you mean the Holocaust never happened? What was your source?" And Zach cites a university professor's website. Well, Alan November, in this essay commentary, um, puts in the commentary the actual URL that Zach used. And it was a university professor's website. But if you looked at the URL carefully, you would have seen a tilde symbol. And the tilde indicates a personal website. And Alan November concluded in 1998, I believe, if I'm correct, that we give the kids the internet, but we don't teach them how to use it. We don't teach them how to think critically about it. And the parallels are today we've got TikTok, and most young people, it appears, are getting their news and information from TikTok. And what's the source? They're not asking that questions. Are they fact checking it? Probably not. Are they verifying it? Probably not. And so I think in today's education system, uh, they're afraid of social media. So I don't think in general it's taught. But educators need to realize, and parents need to realize, we've got to bring these things into the classroom and bring education up to the 21st century. Because in many ways, I think it's still stuck back in 1998. The media literacy questions, the critical thinking questions, are as relevant today as they were back in the 90s. And I've been advocating that librarians, for example, post those critical thinking questions adjacent to every computer, so that every time a student is at that computer doing research, they begin to ask the questions. Who's the author? What's their evidence? Who's going to benefit from this? What techniques are they using to make a message believable? And how does this make me feel? Is it driving emotions? We need to recognize those kinds of things. But in general, media literacy has not found a place in American classrooms. Having said that, I know some educators scattered around the United States who are doing some fantastic things.
Before we started recording, you were telling me about some research you did in the 1990s. I found really fascinating, so I wanted to wait and get it on air for the audience to hear as well. So, can you tell our audience about that research you did in the 90s and what you found about media literacy offerings then? I think it's a really fascinating story.
A little backstory. I was attending a media literacy conference in Colorado, and there was a town hall meeting before it concluded, and they asked people to stand up and give their feelings about what the last few days were like. And I stood up as an educator, and I said, if we want media literacy in schools, someone should look at the teaching standards of all 50 states. And I came back to South Carolina and did just that. I started a critical content analysis of all 50 states' teaching standards. And I partnered with the late Robert Cuby at Rutgers, and we co-authored a commentary in Education Week, in which we had found elements of media literacy in all 50 states, in primarily the three disciplines that we examined: English language arts, social studies, and health. That was the good news. The bad news, if you want to call it that, is the development and the passage of the Common Core teaching standards. Somebody had the brilliant idea that all schools should teach the same thing at the same time, and so we had common standards, teaching standards developed at the time. Yeah, and so my colleague at the time, Richard Beach, and I looked at those English language arts Common Core standards, because primarily media literacy was found in that discipline. And I want to quote from our 2011 Education Week commentary. Other than a mention of the need to evaluate information from multiple oral, visual, or multimodal sources, there is no specific reference in the common standards to critical analysis and production of film, television, advertising, radio, news, pop culture, video games, media remixes, and so on. Nor is there explicit attention on fostering critical analysis of media messages and representations. So there it is. And I have to fault the people who are sitting at the table writing these standards.
Mhm.
And at the time, and it's no longer on their website, there was a list of those folks who were writing those standards. And it's probably no surprise they were textbook and assessment company representatives.
um, yeah, that's so. Another question I had for you too is how did you get into media literacy? Because you have a fascinating background. You both have a background in education and media. So talk about, kind of remind our audience what those backgrounds are, and then tell us how you got interested in media literacy education.
Thanks for asking. I attended the University of Georgia and studied journalism. And when I graduated, I went to work for a local television station here in Columbia, South Carolina. So I got to know the news business a little bit from a local news perspective. I traveled several different TV stations throughout the years. I went to Fort Myers, Florida, Jacksonville, Baltimore. Finally, ended up in Orlando, where I went to work for the public school system. And as I mentioned earlier, I was a buyer of these films and videos, and that really got me started. Why aren't we teaching students how to analyze and question media messages? And as the years would go by, as it happened, I started collecting resources and created a website called the Media Literacy Clearinghouse, whose URL is my name, www.frankWbaker.com. And I would put all of these resources on the website. And eventually, I moved back to South Carolina, went to work for public television here. And when I did, I started attending the curriculum conferences, again, promoting media literacy. So if I was attending a social studies conference, I would do a presentation for educators about how media literacy fits into the social studies, how media literacy fits into a math classroom, science classroom, technology, all of these disciplines. And eventually, I met a vendor who said, I said, I'd like to write a book about media literacy. And the next thing I know, I've written a book for young people. Um, I think it was probably the first series of books published by Capstone Press that examined media, and I wrote this young people's book about media and the movies. I went on to write a book about media and politics for middle school educators, and eventually media literacy in the K-12 classroom and close reading the media. Interestingly enough, my publisher said that book did not sell well, and we both figured out why, because most educators don't know what close reading the media is. They understand close reading of text because that's in the standards, but nobody teaches them how to close read a media text, which is what you and your colleagues have been doing for years.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you're spot on in that. And I've had that same experience with educators struggling to do those close reads of media texts. I'm sure, like me, you spend a lot of time explaining what you do when you are a media literacy research and expert. But it strikes me also that in addition to the formal classroom, there's some parents out there in this audience who may be saying like, okay, I get it. The schools are not offering media literacy, but I still really want my child to be media literate. Do you have some advice or resources that you would recommend to parents who might be in that situation?
I'm, I'm a grandparent now, and so I'm even telling my son and daughter, uh, you need to be intimately aware of what media your children are paying attention to. Uh, it used to be that a child had a computer in the bedroom or television in the bedroom. Well, if that's the case, uh, parents have no idea what they're watching, what they're consuming. And I'm an advocate for co-viewing. You've got to sit there and watch with them and introduce some questions. If it's a Saturday morning, or you're watching the Disney Channel and up comes a commercial for a toy that invariably does something on television in a commercial that you doubt, ask ask them some questions. Do you really think it happens that way? And I've done so many commercials, workshops around toy commercials to pull back the curtain to help create some healthy skepticism among these young people, because you and I both know, come the holiday time of year, kids are going to be begging mom, dad, grandparents to buy them toys. And one of the questions I always ask in these workshops with young people is, how many of you all have had something you received for the holidays or for a birthday that failed to live up to the expectations because of the commercial? Boy, the hands just like pop up. They all want to share a story, which is great. And I'm always saying, all right, so who would you write to if you received a toy that just failed? And I had one child say, I'd write to President Obama. And I'm really trying to get to the fact of, who aired that commercial? Did that TV station or the Disney Channel have any responsibility to air things that are factual? We got car commercials that have to be policed, right? But not toy commercials. Well, in fact, there is a group that oversees toy advertising. It's a Children's Advertising Review Unit. It's part of the Better Business Bureau. So they police the toy advertisers themselves, which, if your audience never heard of CARU, they certainly ought to look it up. But there's no shortage of content for me. And I wake up every morning and I've got the television on and there's a commercial or somebody said something that I go, that's not true. And I'm fact checking it. And if I go to the movies, I'll tell my wife, look at that swish pan or that. No, no, you're ruining it for me. Don't do that. But that's what media literacy is. It's like pulling back the curtain. To young people, I go, you remember the Wizard of Oz when Toto pulled back the curtain to reveal that there was a wizard, a man behind the curtain? Well, I'm Toto. I want to pull back the curtain literally on how media work. I worked in television news. I know a little bit about how it works. And even today, it's hard for me to watch a television newscast because it's mostly not news. it's doctored. Somebody's decided these are the stories we're going to run because we want to bring eyeballs to advertisers. And that's another thing I want young people to know. What's the purpose of television? It's not entertainment. What's the purpose of TikTok? Who is making money? These are the questions you and I are accustomed to asking, and I'm trying to get young people and parents to ask the same questions.
I think it's really important, and it really resonates with me. I always tell folks that when I was younger, I still remember my first media literacy lesson. My parents were working class folks, but I was asking for some new toy on TV, and after a commercial came on, and my mom just kind of casually said like, "Oh, you can't believe those commercials." And that just planted a seed for the rest of my life of like, well, what do you mean? Like they're not true, or I should question them. It was a casual passing comment she made that stuck with me forever. So I think there's a lot of important work that can be done by parents and guardians.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. In fact, there's a short video that I use in most of my workshops. It was produced in the 1990s by HBO and Consumer Reports, entitled Buy Me That. And in one of the first episodes, they showed a toy that glided on water, right? And you see that in this segment. And the producers smartly gave the toy to some kids to take outside and test. And the toy fails miserably in the test outside. And I'm trying to get them to think critically. So there's one shot in the commercial, about 2 seconds long. The toy comes and it hits the water and it keeps going. And I pause it and I go, it doesn't glide on water. They took it into the studio and they put it on some plate glass and they shot it from underneath to make it appear that it glides on water. So creating that healthy skepticism, getting them to ask questions, and 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 for parents, reading reviews. Look at the reviews if you can trust some of those reviews, and just think twice before you spend $50 or $100 on something that's not going to benefit your child.
and then can you also talk about, you mentioned this kind of briefly earlier, but I want to circle back to, I think it's really important. It's something I didn't really value when I was younger, but now that I've gotten older, I've really appreciated. The teachers and parents who encouraged me to make media, even if it was, terrible, unwatchable, unlistenable media, I would make this stuff. And in the process of making media, I learned a lot about how others make media, and it positioned me to ask questions. Can you kind of talk about the importance of having young people make media?
Absolutely. In my workshops, I ask educators to draft their own definition of media literacy. And they share it and they kind of circle the wagon. And I go, media literacy is really this tree with two branches. There's analysis and there is production. And so we've got to make sure that our young people are involved in both. One of the things that I previously did was work with analyzing tobacco advertising out of magazines. So you don't find that much anymore. But in the last 20 years, I had piles of ads that I would distribute to students, and we would deconstruct the ad together. And then I'd say, what if you could change the message? And for the most part, these young people already know about the dangers of smoking. And so by distributing scissors and crayons and paper, they cut up the original ad and create a brand new ad, which you and I might call counter ads, and that tell the real story. And when I worked in Florida, the Truth Campaign started. They took their tobacco settlement money and put it to work educating young people with parity uh, and even more. So we've got to get them involved in production. Most of them have phones. They're already shooting pictures and video, and maybe they're already editing it. So in most parts, they're learning media making without having any formal instruction. And that's where I think the schools could play a good role. You and I probably know what makes a movie good. But do those young people know what makes a movie good, and how many people are involved in making films, and how much time it takes? We should be teaching them not only camera work, but lighting and sound effects, costuming, all of those things. Those are the elements to movie making and filmmaking. So I'm a big advocate for media making, but you don't have to have expensive equipment in a school to make media.
So, Frank, as we wrap up here, I want to make sure our audience hears this from you. I followed you on social media for a long time and your websites. You always have new, interesting content. You have takes on things. You have resources. So, I highly encourage people to follow you and check out your website. Can you let folks know where they can follow you on social media, where they can get more information about your work?
Thanks. On Facebook, I'm Frank W. Baker. The Media Literacy Clearinghouse also has a site on Facebook as well. And I also have a Facebook page for close reading the media. I'm always on the lookout for resources. It might be an article, it might be a book, it might be a link to a video that I find fascinating. And uh, to me, the internet was the quintessential way. I used to work in broadcasting, and so you stand in front of a camera, and the camera transmits you to hundreds and maybe thousands, whatever. The internet provides me the opportunity. Facebook provides me the opportunity to do the same thing. If I created the Media Literacy Clearinghouse website and told nobody about it, then I've wasted my time. I really want parents and educators to know there are some resources out there. If you're an educator, no matter what discipline you are, you can find a resource that's out there. I'm really proud of the website. I'm proud of the books that I've written, and you can find a link to my books at frankwbaker.com as well. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to sell media literacy, and it's not a hard sell, but apparently it is in the United States. But we have to keep doing this work. I say we because you are part of that effort.
Thank you so much, Frank. I think you've sold it well. Folks, check out Frank Baker's work. Frank, thank you so much for coming on the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks for having me, Nolan.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks for tuning in. You can find Disinfo Detox on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Every click helps grow the community and keeps those tech overlords happy. Detox complete.